Oh boy, here we go. Lord help me do this right.
Wherefore the law was our schoolmaster to bring us unto Christ, that we might be justified by faith. Why? What did the law do? Let's see. But that no man is justified by the law in the sight of God is evident, the just shall live by faith.
That is obviously true. The law shows you that you aren't right with God for some reason, because you break the commandments, right? Sin. So the law, like Paul says in Romans, right? It showed him how much of a sinner he was. That's why it goes on to say he's a schoolmaster. So one of the main things in the back of my mind when I'm hearing what, because I'm kind of in the middle a little bit. I don't quite understand it the way as differently from them as who they're engaging with is the Hebrew roots. I'm not quite. I tend to. It's difficult to say. I think some of the things they say I would agree with over a Hebrew roots position, but not necessarily. I don't see necessarily the same things in view as the Hebrew roots being identical. I just think people do misunderstand this. So all this is saying, you have to understand that the context of a lot of what's being taught is the means of justification. In other words, it's clear to me that Paul, I mean, I don't even think the Hebrew roots people deny this, but seems to me anyway, but that the New Testament is saying the Messiah is the promise of God, and he's the way that justifies us, the way the animal sacrifices didn't do and were continually needed, but Jesus' sacrifice isn't. So Paul's essentially saying, look, you're rejecting the Messiah. And it's what Christians say that's incorrect, is that it's all or nothing, that it means to obey God's commandments means you're not accepting the Messiah, just hands down. No, sin is still sin. There's not something, sin doesn't change. The covenant, so in Galatians, the law, and I'll show this, but I'm going to just kind of laying out my thinking in case you don't understand it, anybody who listens to this. The law can be spoken of as in many different ways, with many being spoken of in different contexts. You can almost always refer to that law as the law of Moses when he's talking about the law regarding the covenants and things like that. You can call that the law of Moses, and it is because they're referring to that law which Moses gave, which is the law of God. But aspects, it's a new covenant. So aspects of the law are not the same in the new covenant. You don't have to go to the temple to get your sins forgiven. You don't have to do that there is no sacrifice for sins other than Jesus. But the part of the law that defines sin, what sins are, transgressions, doesn't change. Can't change. It comes from God, who God is. So in here, this is when Paul's talking about the law, he's talking about in the sense of the covenant, the old covenant, in my opinion. So it's not, so when he's saying who's bewitched you, okay, so think about this. sin is the transgression of some law of God, something from God. Jesus died for sins, right? Well, he died for sins as they're defined under the old covenant. If he does away with that which defines those sins, what in the heck do people think they're being saved for? If you're born after the new covenant was inaugurated, was brought to bear, what do you think you don't go to heaven for if you don't believe in Jesus? Why is the world broken? Because they don't have faith in God, meaning they don't care what God says. They say that's why they murder. The answer is coming to God to be changed. What is being conformed to the image of the Son? What does it mean? So, look, if you make this where everything that's in the old covenant is bad, like don't murder, God's now saying, the 10 commandments aren't sin if you break them. Really? Sorry, I'm going on a tangent. Let's watch the video. But my point is, if you're going to make the law everything, then and this is what I'm going to show. It's like, Kelvin basically says you're satanic if you keep the commandments. But John says, if you say you know God and you don't keep his commandments, you're a liar and the truth isn't in you. What do you guys do with that? Do you think Jesus' his commandments are not the same ones as do not murder, do not lie? I mean, Paul says that. Is what matters is keeping the commandments of God. That's what I want to know. What are the commandments of God now? How are the 10 commandments? How are those rules, those principles of being human, how are those not for us? Because if you don't say they're not for us and then tell me, well, I'm not saying you can't murder and you're supposed to lie and you're supposed to cheat and you're supposed to steal and you're supposed to not honor your parents and you're not supposed to love God and not have idols and not take the Lord's name in vain. Which one exactly are you not doing as a Christian? Okay, if you don't want to call it the 10 commandments, I'm saying, as a Christian, do you worship idols or not worship idols? Do you lie or not lie? Do you murder? Jesus, the Sermon on the Mount, is it for us or not? Is Jesus saying, look, if you even hate your brother, was that not true to God? Did God not want them to not hate their brother back in the old covenant? And now he wants us to, because guess what? I was just joshing you guys. No. This Jesus is this God. Those are quotes when he says, love your neighbor as yourself and love God with all your heart, soul, and mind. That is a synopsis of the 10 commandments. It's not a new thing, other than that they weren't doing it. Now they need, and Jesus is showing the way. Jesus magnified that law. He magnified the 10 commandments to show them that, look, you think you're keeping them, but you're not. You need me. You need my help. Look to me. He did it right. He showed love. That's love. But that was God's intention that they weren't doing. That's not satanic. That's Christianity, Kelvin. It's Christianity. Love. You have to understand, Paul's talking about covenants. You're not saved by the covenant and rejection of the new covenant, that you need justification by Christ. That's what it means. It means he's contrasting people who are going back to the time when they didn't have Messiah for justification, thinking that they're justified in that thing. He's not saying, oh, you're so foolish. You who love each other by not hating your brother and not lusting after women. How foolish of you to go back under that law. Don't you know that all that's done away with now? And that's the faith. No, it's establishing the faith. Is that what Jesus taught on the Sermon on the Mount? That's establishing the faith. Jesus is the master. If you reject that, you are not a Christian.
What did I want to? I was looking for that one verse.
Oh, the curse of the law. Did Jesus save us from the curse of the Sermon on the Mount? That's a question. I want to know. Somebody out there, tell me. Did Jesus save us from the curse of his own teaching? And if the Spirit is guiding you to follow the Sermon on the Mount, which ones of the commandments are you breaking when you're doing that? Of the 10 commandments, which ones do you break when you're following the Sermon on the Mount? If you mean, Jamie, the 10 commandments that's given under the Sinai covenant, it's done away with. Okay, I can say that. I don't look at it that way. But tell me, pretend they're not the commandments of God. They're just this idea: do not murder, do not steal. That's good to not do those things, right? In the new covenant, are those still things that are good? Is that what you do when you're not sinning? I mean, these define sin, people. Sin is what we're saved from. There's more to it than that. But if someone says, what do you mean sin? What is that? Well, or what is righteousness? Why is Jesus righteous? The fact that Jesus didn't sin and that he's perfect righteousness, he didn't break any of God's laws, that's part of that definition. In the right spirit of doing those things is love, when you're like positive things that you do. But when you do those things, they can't be called love, and then you're breaking the principles that are laid out in the commandments, because they're a feature of God, who God is. They don't change. They can't change. They're universal, eternal principles, because God is eternal. Oh, you're making God the law. No, I'm not. Divorcing those laws from God is to make God into something other than who he is. And it's obvious if you think about it. Adultery can't ever be okay. Lying is a principle is not good. It's not good to lie. You don't have more lying and that's good somehow. Jesus didn't baptize lying. Jesus didn't baptize murder. In fact, he magnified, look, you're already on the wrong track if you hate your brother. This is basic.
Paul, if you want, I can.
Just to say, I think, well, never mind.
Can't let me do that.
Well, what the law's purpose was is that we have concluded that all are under sin. To think anything else, or to think that you gain or merit anything with God, as far as righteousness with him and peace with him.
So I know, Paul, when you say that, and you often say things like, you guys are saying we're saying this. Like, even with Kelby, who's even going to be stricter about the distinctions here, the difference between us. You're doing what you're always saying, accusing us of doing. But whenever I do that sort of thing, it's a question. It's like, well, it seems like you're saying this. I guess it seems like you're saying we merit our justification. Clearly, Galatians 3 says you cannot merit. That's the purpose of the law here. That's what this is saying. It brings us to Christ, right? Is that still true? Because you're born after the new covenant was made. This context is the changing from to the new covenant in the transition period, although this is written slightly after a transition period, but that's the idea. He's dealing with people who are transitioning somewhat, or dealing with people who are being confused by people who are confused by the transitioning. Okay. That being said, I'm not necessarily speaking for Yahoo here. You might disagree with this, but this is my position. I don't have a problem with saying it's the new covenant. That's what the Bible says. It's God's way of justifying through Christ, which was the purpose the whole time, pointing to that. Yes, I agree with all that. Yes, it was our schoolmaster. Well, not ours. You can't say that, right? Seems like this doesn't apply to you, because unless you're speaking really, I mean, you make a distinction between Israel and the church. I mean, Calvi, that's the problem. Calvi's confused on this because he's trying to defend dispensationalism. He doesn't know which version is right, and because they actually they can't take this position of like, essentially, when you argue Galatians covenantally, this is very hard to explain, but see, the dispensationalists say that many of them, anyways, not all of them, but they'll say, well, the old covenant's still for the Jews, which makes no sense, right? Because Paul's talking about how the transition from the old to the new covenant. You can't really be a dispensationalist and read it that way, because that's like denying that the old covenant is still for the Jews, unless you think non-believing Jews are saved through the old covenant. They don't even have to believe in Jesus eventually, which makes no sense. But essentially, to argue Galatians this way is saying, really messes up dispensationalism, let me put it that way, which is very interesting, by the way. I'm trying to think this through exactly what I mean. Yeah. So tell me, did the Jews have to bring, is this talking about the Jewish old covenant people? And now some people are what? What's going on here? Thinking they're justified by the law. I don't even have a problem with saying that's any of the law, the whole law, anything from in the old covenant. Without Messiah, you can't be justified. Everybody needs to be justified in Messiah. But you guys, it seems to me, therefore, sin isn't still sin. God did this to put all under sin to drive them to Christ. So what does under the law mean? Don't keep the commandments? The commandments don't define what sin is that you're being saved from? You guys have no definition. I guess you think God just wants you to believe in Jesus, and that means don't keep the laws, because they're satanic now if you try to keep the law. Well, it depends on what you mean by the law. That I'm saying, when I say that, I'm not saying you have to keep the law of Moses as it's exactly in the Old Testament. I'm saying this is why Christianity historically has understood this. It's more complicated but it's certainly at least this, that the Ten Commandments define sin in the New Covenant, because they're eternal laws of God. Murdering is still sin. That's why the Ten Commandments are separate. They're different. That's why they're clearly a different thing. They're like a constitution about who God is and how what does it mean to be conformed to the image of the Son? It means a lot of things, but it certainly includes not murdering and not lying and not cheating and not coveting and not worshiping idols and not taking the Lord's name in vain and not loving God. Those things, you do those things as you're being conformed to the image of the Son. Those are things you do or you refrain from as you are being conformed to the image of the Son. I can't, for the life of me, I can't see how anybody would argue with that. How can you argue with that? This is like the slam dunk go-to verse, is to say, look, we don't have to not murder and you're not saying that, right? Okay, good. Then that part of the law is not done away with then, is it? Obviously. It's so obvious that to say it's like, what are you saying? Because he's going to talk out of both sides of his mouth. He's going to say all this stuff that the law's done away with. Why are you saying we're supposed to do this stuff? It's satanic. Which, by the way, is calling evil good and good evil, by the way. I wonder what do you guys think they won't endure sound doctrine means when Paul predicts that, when it's predicted in the New Covenant, that lawlessness will abound and the love of many will grow cold. Do you believe Jesus on that? What is he talking about? because of lawlessness, the love of many will grow cold. What does that mean to you? They don't keep, like they jaywalk. What does it mean? What does Jesus mean that when he's talking about Matthew 24, the last days before his coming, and he talks about, will the Son of Man find faith on the earth? What does he mean when he says, the one Jesus Christ is going to come, and he's going to, with the breath of his mouth, the spirit of his mouth, and the brightness of his coming, he's going to destroy the man of sin, which is synonymous with the man of lawlessness. And in those last days, people are going to follow after that man, and lawlessness will abound because the love of many will grow cold. The Antichrist is called the man of lawlessness. And Jesus says, because of lawlessness, the love of many shall grow cold. And when Paul talks about love, the whole law hangs on love. And then he lists the 10 commandments, and any other commandment can be briefly comprehended. When I briefly comprehend something and I say, it would be like saying, there's a chair in my room, there's a bed in my room, there's a dresser in my room, a light bulb in my room, a clock in my room, a mirror in my room, and anything else in my room can be briefly comprehended as my room is full of stuff. A bunch of stuff in my room can be categorized as all, and then I list all those things. Is the stuff in my room not the things I just listed? When I say the stuff in my room is a way to briefly comprehend that my room is full of stuff? Does it mean my room is full of stuff? All the things I told you about that are individual things in my room are now no longer the stuff in my room, which is a brief way of saying I have a room full of stuff. When I say that, am I saying all those things I said are in my room are not in my room? Because I said it's briefly comprehended as a bunch of stuff. Is that what that means? That'd be really confusing. When Paul said, we keep the commandments of God, and he's speaking to a bunch of Jewish people and a bunch of people that know the laws of God, and he says, we keep the commandments of God. Is that an esoteric way of saying? It definitely means God's not teaching. He's now saying the commandments are done away with. The commandments of God are definitely not the 10 commandments anymore. Definitely not. In fact, that's satanic. The commandments of God are certainly, here's the patience of the saints. They keep the commandments of God and have the faith of Jesus. That's obviously not don't murder and don't steal and don't lie and don't cheat and love God with all your heart, soul, and mind. Don't take his name in vain. Obviously, that's not the commandments of God now. It's this different thing. Is that it? I'm not even going to play it, but he basically said, they basically say the law is satanic. And then he goes on, I'm not saying that we shouldn't follow God's rules and God's law. Well, what are they then? Tell us what they are.